Welcome. Is that on? Yeah, you can hear me? All right. It's not on. It's not on? Totally. It's totally on. I'm not on the microphone as often as, this guy is, so. Who thinks the political environment is, completely insane? Two hands. It is. And why is that the case? It's because we have been far too complacent for far too long. While we've been at home changing diapers, crazy people have been taking over our civil society. So what does Chesterton have to say about all this? Skyler's going to tell us in a minute. But in May of 1933, which is almost 100 years ago, Chesterton wrote, "From the time when the state was governed by the man who had the most strength, most soldiers at his command, to the time when the state is governed by the man with the most money, the loudest voice, or the most newspapers at his command, the church has been both a help and a nuisance to the state. It has been a help in teaching people to behave themselves, to keep social order, and bear their trials patiently. It has been a nuisance in insisting that people who do so must be governed with justice on a socially and economically fair basis. The church has upheld the authority of the state, but it has most inconveniently set limits to and defined the proper exercise of that authority. What is the role of the church in the political order and the society at large? What is the proper relationship between the church and the state? Chesterton's words give us a hint of the historical role the church has played and may yet play as the traces of Christendom are aggressively excised from the public square in America and across the West. In exploring these questions, Skyler will draw on the work of contemporary Catholic political philosophers and theologians who have offered answers rooted in history and in tradition. Skyler Kressin is a director of the Society for American Civic Renewal, a fraternal organization seeking accountability and virtue in the exercise of authority in politics, business, and in cultural institutions. He is also a CPA who advises clients on a variety of tax planning matters with an eye to long-term family wealth preservation and strategy. He is a father of 6, married to his high school sweetheart, and a recent convert to Catholicism, due in no small part to Chesterton and his writings. Please join me in welcoming Skyler Kressin.
Well, thank you, Glert, for the introduction. I want to call to mind that quote at the end of my talk again from Chesterton to see whether or not that stands up to and what your evaluation is in the Q&A of that quote in light of my talk tonight. So I will read it again at the end of my talk, but I'd like to make that the topic of kind of the evaluation of this historical analysis. Here in the inland Northwest, you can tell how people feel about the state or the government by the number of "Don't Tread on Me" flags flying proudly off the backs of pickup trucks and on flagpoles situated on acreage. And much like the western U.S., the rest of the western U.S. and Northwest specifically, we are a very unchurched part of the country. The fewer official affiliations, loyalties, rules, regulations, and duties, the better. Many of us, myself included, are transplants, usually from places where regulations and laws threaten to close businesses and officially incorporate perversity as the norm at the highest levels of law. Is it any wonder then why such anti-government or anti-state attitudes abound among us? On the other hand, there seems to be a burgeoning flourishing of Catholicism and traditional Christianity more generally in this part of the country. From the establishment of the classical Christian schooling movement south of us in Moscow, to Chesterton Academy, to the many families open to life in our parishes, we appear to be witnessing an authentic return to the traditions of our forefathers in the faith. The life of our parishes, ministries, and schools have become focal points for many of us, ushering in a social life centered on the faith we perhaps didn't think possible, especially in contrast to the still masking coastal metros many of us have retreated from. This is where our loyalties lie and where our faith is nourished, in these institutions. The reason for this stark contrast in terms of loyalties between the institutions of the church and the institutions of the state is obvious at first glance. One is hostile to the faith and our families. The other is usually a source of support. On the other hand, I think this easy explanation threatens to lead us to three questionable and possibly dangerous conclusions. Namely, one, that the authority we call government or the state is inherently corrupt and to be rejected in all of its instantiations. Two, that we can effectively separate and replace such an authority with the social life of the church and its institutions. And number three, that the church and the state are inherently separate and opposed institutions, one ruling so-called secular society, indifferent to the life of faith of its citizens, and the other providing for the spiritual well-being of the faithful. I believe each of these conclusions are ultimately mistaken, though understandable, and I hope to show you why. I will begin with an alternative vision of the state, which does not regard the temporal authority as a hostile power outside and above society, but rather regards such authority as an integral component of the entire familial, social, and judicial framework of any community. I'll start with the section entitled The Pre-Modern State, quote unquote. In the very early days of the Roman Republic, when the Romans had not yet become the dominant power on the Italian peninsula, let alone the Mediterranean world, their rivals, the Etruscans, were a grave threat. In these days, the Etruscan king Lars Porsensa marched upon Rome. Having won a brief battle in the field before the Tiber River, he advanced on the city with his army, emboldened by their success. The Etruscans advanced up to the Tiber and were approaching the one bridge which would have given them access to the city, the Pons Sublicius. A junior officer on the bridge, Publius Horatius Cocles, seeing the rout and the threat to Rome should the Etruscans gain the bridge, bravely jumped down to face the entire Etruscan army alone. Two commanders of the retreating Roman troops, seeing Horatius' bravery, jumped down to join him on the bridge. The three brave Romans defended the bridge with white-hot courage, seeing to it that the bridge could be destroyed before the advancing army of the Etruscans could cross. For their bravery, they are remembered down through the centuries in song and poetry, and in Thomas Macaulay's poem, Horatius, we are afforded a glimpse of the ancient Roman spirit which enabled such a noble defense. Macaulay, after beautifully describing the scene and the decision of Horatius to defend the bridge, explains, "For Romans in Rome's quarrel spared neither land nor gold, nor son, nor wife, nor limb, nor life in the brave days of old. Then none were for a party, then all were for the state. Then the great men helped the poor, and the poor men loved the great. Then lands were fairly portioned, then spoils were fairly sold. The Romans were like brothers in the brave days of old." Imagine feeling this way toward the state now. Imagine anyone describing, centuries hence, the current American context as the brave days of old, where all were for the state. That poetry will not be written unless it is to memorialize the bravery of those facing what some have begun to call the globalist American empire. But why is this the case? What was the nature of that pre-modern state? that Macaulay refers to? What evoked such loyalty and such courage on behalf of Rome by young Horatius? Aristotle, referred to by St. Thomas as simply the philosopher, argues famously in the Politics that man is only fully man as citizen of a polis, a city-state. His family is important, foundational in fact. His village and his tribe are important and further key components of the ongoing flourishing of a people. But it is in the city that the full flourishing of human nature is made possible, and where mankind becomes fully human as a being capable of reason and virtue. That may seem a bold claim, and to us in many ways it is. The incarnation and the grace bestowed by baptism and the sacraments is what makes us whole and restores our nature in light of the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. But I don't think these claims are mutually exclusive. What Aristotle is arguing here is that the polis, or city-state, provides for the integrated social order of religion, justice, and community necessary, though not sufficient, for human flourishing in the temporal realm. What does that mean? Let's dig deeper into the pre-modern polis, or state, both ancient and medieval, to see if we can derive an explanation and answers. I will be relying in this first section on the ancient city, or the ancient polis, on The Ancient City, a book by the French historian Fustel de Coulanges, which goes into great detail in exploring the familial, religious, and political life of the ancient Greeks and Romans as representatives of the ancient civilizations of the Mediterranean that spoke Indo-European languages. It is very difficult for the modern mind to comprehend the extent to which religion played a role in these ancient cultures, shaping every aspect of one's existence, from the day they were born, and imbuing the familial, social, legal, and political order that came about in the city-states of the Greeks and the Italian peninsula. First, let's examine the features of the early religion of these people. The honor of their ancestors reigned supreme, and their duties were to their fathers of old in sacrifices, hymns, and ceremonies. The honor of the hearth and the virtues of domestic life and family culture were literally worshipped in the form of the hearth fire god, at first specific to each family, and then expanding to a general version, Vesta for the Romans, Hestia for the Greeks, that was never allowed to go out. They would maintain this fire in an enclosure on their hearth. They never allowed it to go out. One day a year they would relight it. It was the duty of the sons of the family and the women of the family to continually relight this as it represented the ancestors and continued virtues of that family. Each family conducted its own ceremonies and rites, with the father as priest and his sons as his successors in the faith of the family. The honor of dead ancestors was manifested in the right to family property, not because of some primordial right to the land, but because that was a means by which generations could honor the dead in their family tombs from generation to generation. From this family religious culture arose extended family groups and tribes who acknowledged the same distant ancestors and who clustered around the same lands for the work of the rites and the sacrifices owed to the dead. Finally, from these groupings came cities, confederations of families, and tribes who ultimately literally united around a single flame or hearth fire in the center of the city, which represented the continuation of their respective lines, together in a sacred bond of honor and citizenship, implying a pledge to keep the memories and souls of the ancestors of each family, of each tribe, sacred in the common defense and in the common citizenship of the city-state or polis. Is it any wonder, then, how Horatius could jump to the defense of Rome in its peril, and how Macaulay could say of that time, "For Romans in Rome's quarrel spared neither land nor gold, nor son nor wife, nor limb nor life in the brave days of old, then none was for party, then all were for the state." For the state was not some outside thing, some contrived sovereignty beyond the hearts and hearths of the citizens. It was a thing grounded in and only made to exist, if we can even say that it did exist as an independent entity, through the various subsidiary components of the social and familial order. And in this ancient context, natural virtue, as much as could be found, apart from the law of Moses and prior to the truth and reality of the incarnation, abounded. Chesterton, I think you might be wondering when I was going to bring him in the Everlasting Man, in fact, attributes much virtue to the ancient Romans. Indeed, he argues that the Christendom of medieval Europe, the virtues and civilizational glory of which we're still benefiting from today, was ushered in, at least instrumentally, by the virtue of these Romans. How so? Well, they faced down and utterly defeated a demonic foe, whose religion and whose system of government, or state, was inimical to the natural law, and which could never have provided the seedbed for Christianity like the Romans did. That foe was Carthage, the new town and great mercantile colony turned empire of the Phoenicians as they expanded across the Mediterranean. The worshippers of Moloch, whose religion and social order were founded upon the human sacrifice of infants and the use of cheap or forced labor for both work and for war in the form of mercenaries, enabled the citizens of Carthage to grow immeasurably wealthy as merchants at the cost of any shred of natural virtue they may have had. Let us return to the Romans. In the 7th chapter of The Everlasting Man, entitled The War of the Gods and Demons, Chesterton describes the very grounded and familial religion of the social order of the Romans in that time. What strikes us, quote, what strikes us in the Italian cults is their local and especially their domestic character. This religion of the home was very homely. And the truth is that only men to whom the family is sacred will ever have a standard or a status by which to criticize the state. They alone can appeal to something more holy than the gods of the city, the gods of the hearth. The spirit that lifted Rome from beneath was the spirit of all the Romans. And it is not a cant to call it the ideal of Cincinnatus passing from the Senate to the plow. Men of that sort had strengthened their village on every side, had extended its victories already over the Italians and even over the Greeks, when they found themselves confronted with a war that changed the world. I've called it here the War of the Gods and the Demons. And he in turn describes Carthage. Carthage, as in the parent cities of Phoenicia, the god who got things in Carthage, as in the parent cities of Phoenicia, the god who got things done bore the name Moloch, who is perhaps identical with the other deity whom we know as Baal, the Lord. The Romans did not at first quite know what to call him or what to make of him. They had to go back to the grossest myth of Greek or Roman origins. But the worshippers of Moloch were not gross or primitive. They were members of a mature and polished civilization, abounding in refinements and luxuries. They were probably far more civilized than the Romans. And Moloch was not a myth, or at any rate, his meal was not a myth. These highly civilized people really met together to invoke the blessing of heaven on their empire by throwing hundreds of their infants into a large furnace. End quote. What's more, they represented fundamentally different conceptions of the nature of authority in the temporal realm, which originated in their religious and familial practices. On the one hand, there was Rome, grounded in the religion of the hearth and devoted to the honor of ancestors, whose wealth was in the character of its people as citizen farmers willing to personally take up arms in time of need to defend the city. And on the other hand, there was Carthage, a more advanced civilization, sacrificing its young to the dark demon god Moloch, and whose wealth came from the labor of other peoples and the markups of middlemen, which paid for the mercenary armies it employed in its wars. This contrast, as some of you will have guessed, prefigures the ongoing struggle between two rival conceptions of the nature of authority in the temporal realm, and we will return to it when discussing the modern conception of the state that arose as European Christendom began to crumble. We'll move on now to the medieval conception, another instantiation of the pre-modern state. Let's fast forward nearly a millennium and a half beyond the utter defeat of Carthage at the hands of Rome. That victory, as Chesterton notes, paved the way for the rise of Christendom in Europe, a Roman and Greek pagan world transformed by the truth of the Incarnation, but with enough vestiges of natural virtue to accept the gospel and all its implications. And the product of that thorough acceptance of the Incarnation at every level of society reached its apex in the sacramental kingdom of King St. Louis IX. As we continue, I will be drawing heavily on Before Church and State, the excellent work of history and political philosophy detailing the Kingdom of St. Louis by Andrew Willard Jones, published in 2017. Louis IX was born shortly after the dawn of the 13th century, into a time and place thoroughly imbued with the spirit of medieval Catholicism at every level of society and culture, but beset by a heresy that was once again rearing its ugly head in the south of France. That heresy was the Gnostic and dualistic heresy of Catharism, or Albigensianism, a belief that regarded the flesh and the spirit as fundamentally distinct and essentially separate, which resulted in the extremes of, on the one hand, extreme physical self-denial, and on the other, extreme carnality and degraded fleshly vice. The early church had faced similar heresies, rooted in the mystical Gnostic cults of North Africa and the Levant, in the great ages of the church fathers and the early ecumenical councils, and had always opposed their tendency to creep into the theology and practice of the faithful. This continual return to a Gnostic duality haunts us even today, with the rejection of a sacramental and incarnational understanding of liturgy and worship, and a tendency among many to view any attachments to material and natural goods as unfitting for any Christian. The particular instantiation of this age-old Gnostic heresy, present during King St. Louis IX's reign, again called Catharism, afflicted the entire social order of southern France, centered on the great medieval city and stronghold of Toulouse. On the one hand, there were the perfecti, those who practiced a form of extreme asceticism and rejected anything they regarded as attached to the material world. They abstained from all animal food and avoided eating anything considered to be a byproduct of sexual reproduction. They rejected capital punishment. They rejected the killing of any sort. And finally, they rejected human sexual reproduction, under the belief that it continued the corrupt chain of material life and prevented the ascent to the world of pure spirit, unsullied by the irredeemably corrupt physical world. Many at the time were consequently accused of engaging in sodomy for sexual gratification to prevent the conception of children, though this practice is only suspected and not confirmed. Robed in black, these purveyors and practitioners of extreme self-denial were regarded as holy men by the general and women by the general population of southern France. So much for the perfecti. On the other side of the coin of this dualism, however, we find those who formed the more general population of the region. In particular, what we find is extreme vice in the form of widespread physical violence, unmoored from any higher conception of justice. Mercenaries were frequently employed by the local lords to conduct private wars for personal gain, and villages were often ravaged by troops for hire, marauding, raping, and pillaging. Feuds between minor nobility and their use of violence, theft, and pillaging to settle them had become the norm. The commentators of the day referred to these perfecti on the one hand, and these mercenaries and rogue feudal lords on the other, as one single category of people, enemies of the peace and the faith. They were enemies of the peace and the faith precisely because their mirror image was the integrated order of authority in the kingdom, wielding on the one hand the temporal and on the other the spiritual swords. The mirror of the perfecti were the Orthodox clergy and religious. The mirror image of the mercenaries and rogue lords were the Christian knights and nobility adhering to justice. These two, the temporal authority and the spiritual authority, were engaged in one united project, though their roles differed, namely, the business of the peace and the faith. While the heretics and the men of violence were engaged in a dualistic and Gnostic splitting of the material and spiritual into mutually exclusive categories, the Orthodox clergy and the Christian knights were engaged in the project of upholding the sacramental reality of the incarnation in society. This bears some further explanation. As Catholics, we believe that the world reflects the reality of the incarnation. As St. Athanasius puts it in his work on the incarnation, God became man so that man might become like God. Christ took on our human nature, but retained his divine nature, effectively uniting the two in one person, and we are called to sanctification through participation in the grace bestowed to us in light of the incarnation. But how is this achieved? It is achieved in a manner entirely consistent with this reality of the nature of the incarnation as divine and human, spiritual and material, through the sacraments. Baptism, the Eucharist, and all the sacraments consist of spiritual and physical elements united in one complete act of regeneration. And this integrated sacramental understanding extends to our own identity as humans as well. We're not merely spirits inhabiting a body, nor bodies without a soul, but integrated beings whose entirety of being contains both spiritual and physical elements united in one person. We await the resurrection of the dead, as we say in the Creed, because of this integrated unity of identity. Furthermore, this extends to the things that go beyond the sacraments of the Church and our self-understanding as human beings made in the image of God. It extends to the fabric of society as well. The medieval Church and the kingdom of St. Louis had absorbed this truth and did all they could to manifest it in the business of the peace and the faith, that united project informed by the incarnation. The temporal sword was wielded in the interest of peace, of justice done to wrongdoers, or peace maintained between Christian lords, of the proper rights and duties observed for the customs of particular regions, towns, guilds, and religious institutions, and of restitution given for harms done and violations of the peace. The king, the nobility, the local authorities, and whatever small instantiation were able to exercise authority in the interest of justice, informed above all by the truth of the incarnation and the ethical precepts as provided for by natural law, local custom, and the ethical dictates of the Church. I should pause here to note a very Chestertonian point here, because in the exercise of this justice, the officers of the king preserved in every case the principle of subsidiarity. If a particular region had a particular abbot or a particular local lord or a particular guild master who had claim over justice in that particular region, the courts of the king would honor their ability to exercise justice in that region. It was always consistent with the principle of subsidiarity and of the custom of allowing the smallest possible unit govern itself. It's very consistent with Chesterton's point about the economic sphere, that we should instantiate this in the economic realm as well in terms of distributism. The Church, for her part, exercised authority in the interest of the business of the peace and the faith, in ensuring that the causes of the violations of the good order of society, namely heresy and its fruits, were rooted out. The Inquisition gets a bad name in modernist reading of history, unfairly, I believe, as it was a key component of maintaining a fully Christian and incarnational social order in conformity to truth. When people think about the incarnation or the Inquisition, they don't think about the heretics that I just described, the perfecti, the cathars. They were pretty bad. There's no question that they went beyond the pale, both of any Christian theology and any natural law even. So the work of the Inquisition, I think, was a fair and proper mission. So in summary, the business of the peace and the faith was carried on by a regime and order of authority with two swords and one united mission. The king and the clergy acted in concert for the furtherance of this mission, and rather than being opposed and separate, were rather distinct elements of the same purpose. To ensure that truth and justice reigned in the land, wrongdoers and heretics were given their just deserts as subverters of truth and justice, and that the faithful were nourished in their continued path to holiness. Was this order of authority called the state? Was it called the church? Certainly not. There was but one ultimate authority, and that was Christ the King, and the truth of his incarnation and reign. Two swords were merely the instruments of his authority, delegated by him to exercise that authority over the temporal and spiritual aspects of his kingdom. With such a conceptual background, one could go into great detail as to how King St. Louis, as well as the Orthodox clergy and the Pope, fought heresy and unrestrained violence and vice in the realm. I could talk about the associations of aid that were formed. I could talk about the guilds. I could talk about any number of these institutions that existed beyond the atomized, individualized economic and social situations we have now. But I would recommend rather that you read the book Before Church and State. Again, an excellent resource for both the history and the conceptual framework of this, as it is rightly called, this most Christian kingdom. So let's pause here and consider the questionable conclusions I raised at the beginning of this talk, namely that the authority we call the government or the state is inherently corrupt and to be rejected in all its instantiations. Two, that we can effectively separate and replace such an authority with the social life of the church and its institutions. And three, that the church and the state are inherently separate and often opposed institutions, one ruling the so-called secular society, indifferent to the life of faith and its citizens, and the other providing for the spiritual well-being of the faithful. I hope the previous descriptions, both of the ancient city-state and the medieval realm of King St. Louis, have made at least made these claims slightly less plausible, but I think we need to strengthen our case by looking more closely at the modern era, the era immediately following the Middle Ages and Renaissance, where a new theory of governance and authority came to the fore, in the salons and universities, and eventually among the elites eager to justify their own power. As the 17th century progressed and men like Descartes and Bacon and Hobbes began to speculate entirely outside the classical and medieval tradition of philosophy, a radically different conception of the nature of authority in society arose. This new conception purported to throw off the shackles of ancient and medieval superstition and to free the social order from the strictures of religion as distinct from the secular. In the 13th century, secular meant merely those acting within time, the secular clergy, parish priests, and other who exercised temporal authority of the peace and the faith, whereas the religious meant monks and nuns who had committed themselves to a rule of life and prayer that transcended time. In this new conception, society was fundamentally split between not temporal and timeless concerns, but between the church and the state, as rival claimants to what the moderns called sovereignty. Sovereignty is essentially a monopoly on ultimate authority and ultimate ability to use violence in a given territory. Underlying this concept is an assumption that Andrew Willard-Jones articulates well in his introduction to Before Church and State. Quote, I contend that ultimately the assumption that underpins the modern understanding of politics, the assumption that leads us to see sovereignty as always historically relevant, is the same assumption that underpins the doctrine of the secular, quote, and so the existence of, quote, religion as a separate private thing. And this assumption is the existence of a primordial violence. The idea was articulated most directly by Hobbes. Humankind is in a state of constant warfare, everyone against everyone. The sovereign power of the state is a violence so profound and so predictable in its application that everyone submits. With this assumption in place, and with a conception of society as individuals competing for scarce resources, as always in danger of falling back into the state of primordial war of all against all, the relationship between church and state becomes a problem to solve, a problem of sovereignty. Only one power can be sovereign, and that power, by this inexorable logic, must be the purportedly neutral state that simply keeps the mass of individuals from killing one another. The history of the Middle Ages, therefore, and the history even of the most Christian kingdom of St. Louis, is a history of the struggle for sovereignty in this interpretation and under this assumption. The king simply needed the organizational infrastructure to best the church, and by this effort and infrastructure, the state appeared, ready to adjudicate the private rights and conflicts of the citizens without reference to ecclesiastical courts, excommunications, and all of that superstitious nonsense. As we have seen, this is exactly how the government, from the days of the absolute monarchs in the 17th century to our own time, has justified its continued existence and continued sidelining of the faith and all of its social implications from public life and law. Rather than a common project aimed at the peace of the society, social order, and upholding the truth of the faith that sustained the people, the coexistence of the church and the state in the public realm was a competition for power, the ultimate power of sovereignty. And before we examine the merits of this assumption and framework, and that of the baseline existence of primordial violence necessitating a sovereign state, sovereign purportedly neutral state, would like to expand upon this conception of the supposedly neutral secular public order by reference to the excellent, recently published book, It Is Right and Just, by Scott Hahn and Brandon McGinley. Hahn and McGinley rightly traced the development of the state to the founding of the democratic republican regimes that we now call liberal, including that of the United States and most of Western Europe. They are liberal because they are classically liberal, or in other words, purportedly neutral as to the choices and freedoms of individuals. You will hear many who may perhaps attend our parishes or who we may admire for speaking out against some of the excesses of the left today call themselves classical liberals. So this is what I'm referring to. As Hahn writes elsewhere, liberalism puts the rights and liberties of the individual at the center of the constellation of political values, displacing communal duties and pursuit of common good. Liberalism therefore conceives of society not as an organic whole with various goods that are proper to that whole, but as a collection of autonomous individuals pursuing their own good. The modern state led naturally to this conception of society because of society over which the state holds sovereignty is primordially violent competition among individuals for scarce material possessions and resources, then of course the purpose of the state is to provide in a neutral manner for the safety and autonomy of each individual. In my mind, there's a direct line from a modernist state and liberalism in all its instantiations, classical or otherwise. As an aside, and Jones points this out, ironically, libertarian political theory is highly critical of the state. Remember the "don't tread on me" flags flying around here? As being inherently oppressive to what each individual might do to his own property or his own body, but the existence of such expansive rights to do whatever they feel like with their self-owned bodies, private property, etc., depends on the existence of a neutral state enforcing such claims without reference to communal duties, the common good, any of the things that I described of the old Roman and medieval orders. Are they all that different from the libertine left, which calls for the state to enforce their own conceptions of liberation from the strictures of social norms and standards? In their chapter entitled "Liberal Societies Are Necessarily Secular," Hahn and McGinley argue that the modern liberal state, by virtue of its purported neutrality, rules out society explicitly and comprehensively organized around truths. Truths about the nature and end of man, about the ethical constraints on the individual choices for the good of the individual, about the nature of the cosmos, as seen to be religious and thus inadmissible in any public policy, decision, or governance. Again, we have an embedded assumption number 2, that society can be ruled in a neutral manner, to add to our original modernist assumption that the natural state of mankind, even after the incarnation and the fruits of baptism and the sacraments, is primordial violence. Liberal theorists believe the state truly can be neutral, a neutral arbiter of competing truth claims about the deepest things in life, and that it can maintain that neutrality in the face of the ever-expanding fracturing of individuals and communities. Well, let's examine these assumptions in turn. Assumption number 1, the natural state of man is primordial violence, competition for power, giving rise to the necessity of sovereignty as exercised by a neutral state. I say, on the contrary, as Jones writes, within Christianity, peace is a primordial condition after the incarnation, and violence is a sin, an aberration, a corruption. St. Thomas treated peace as the final end of being itself. We have to allow for the possibility that two people can have a relationship that is not predicated ultimately on competition for power, one over the other. And if we don't believe that, then we don't believe in the power of the sacraments and of the incarnation, in my opinion. Point number 2 against this assumption is that constraining violence by the use of force is not itself, properly speaking, violence. It is justice being served within the framework of truths of the natural law and Christian revelation. So for those who would criticize a state like that of St. Louis, who obviously used violence to punish wrongdoers, this is the retort to that. The state has no such reference points, the supposedly neutral state, as did St. Louis. Assumption number 2 is that the social order can be ruled in a way that is neutral to the questions of what is good, what is true, what is beautiful. And I say, on the contrary, any time a modern regime makes a decision about what to outlaw, what to punish, what to allow, what to promote, it abandons all neutrality, and you can see it happening all the time around us. No neutrality is possible in the public realm. There will always be a hierarchy embedded in any system of law and social order. As Hahn and McGinley write, every soul and every society orders itself to some notion of the good, and thus some object of religious devotion and worship. The question is not whether we will organize our souls and societies around a religious principle, but whether the principle will be true and complete, or false and corrupted. This is worth expanding upon. I think all of us prior to the year 2020 would have been sympathetic, or at least many of us, to the conception of the state and its neutrality as being a real achievable thing. Certainly in the history of Republican democratic societies in the last couple of hundred years, the narrative is that that neutrality was what brought us out of the bad old days of the wars of religion. But I think what happened in the year 2020 was very revealing as to the nature of this supposed neutrality. I think that our eyes were opened as to what this meant. What this meant was that there was an official neutrality at the level of official propaganda, I should say. But in reality, what this sidelining of the faith for so many centuries has done is opened the floodgates for new rights, new religions, new conceptions of the good, and new moral imperialisms, but this time unmoored from any grounding in tradition. I'll note a few trends. One, you see people increasingly identifying as spiritual but not religious. We don't actually see a major decrease in the percentage of people that believe in supernatural forces, but what we do see is that they're unmoored from the traditions of the faith. The interest in the paranormal and the occult is rising steadily. Yoga is not a neutral thing to do. It's something that includes Hindu prayers, and I think the practitioners know this, even if not explicitly. There's the extremely disturbing new religious right, which is the encouragement among radical feminists to scream their abortion. If this isn't a religious right, I don't know what is. At the same time, there's a decline in the new atheism of the mid-aughts that many of us read of and talked about, discussed, debated. Men like Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris. This was viewed as a real threat to religion and faith. Where are those men now? No one cares what Richard Dawkins is saying. No one cares what Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett are saying. The new atheists, irrelevant. Turns out nobody cares about their pet theories about the non-existence of the supernatural. Instead, we're returning to this strange time of cults that you saw in the south of France in the 13th century, that you saw in the decline of the Roman Empire. Again, we've opened the floodgates. The return of Gnostic dualism is among us. We have gender ideology, which your body somehow does not correspond to your sex or your gender. We have the hostility towards reproduction. Birth rate in the U.S. is the lowest in ever its recorded history at 1.65. The data just came out. The majority of men aged 18 through 35 are single. They have no partner whatsoever. On top of that, we have the rise of the religion of, some have called it wokeism. I think it's been ruminating for some time now and really only now ascending to preeminence of place. In 2002, the political theorist Paul Gottfried wrote in Multiculturalism and the Politics of Guilt Toward a Secular Theology that social guilt, anti-fascist education, and the search for subterranean prejudice in all its forms, wherever it could be found, are integral to the moral mission of European and American politicians and intellectuals. The mental cleansing that these sensitizers desire must go so deep that it can never be brought to completion. the road is indeed everything. But on the never-ending road towards the unattainable goal, the prescribed re-education warrants a draconian control over citizens who remain susceptible to the old ways. This was written in 2002, nearly 20 years ago, and the fruits of this mindset are really coming home to roost now, with the critical race theory that's happening in universities and schools. Another quotation that I'll use here is from the First Things article by Adrian Vermeule entitled "The Liturgy of Liberalism." And what he's talking about here is the new religion that has arisen and the liturgy that really has arisen with it. He says, quote, "Liberalism needs an enemy to maintain its sacramental dynamism. It can never rest in calm waters, basking in the day of victory. It is essential that at any given moment there should be a new battle to be fought. The good liberal should always be able to say, we have made progress, but there is still much to do. This is why the triumph of same-sex marriage actually happened too suddenly and too completely. Something else was needed to animate liberalism, and transgenderism has quickly filled the gap, defining new forces of reaction and thus enabling new iterations and celebrations of the liturgy. And if endorsement and approval of self-described gender identity becomes a widely shared legal and social norm, a new frontier will be opened, and some new issue will move to the top of the public agenda, something that now seems utterly outlandish and is guaranteed to provoke fresh opposition from the cruel forces of reaction. Polygamy, perhaps, or mandatory veganism, or polyamory, any number of things we could name now that would seem unthinkable before. So again, let's return to our three questionable conclusions that might result from the circumstances we find ourselves in and evaluate them. Number one, that authority we call the government or the state is inherently corrupt and to be rejected in all its instantiations. All I would say to that, and I'm interested in your thoughts in the Q&A, is that depends on what we mean. Is the modernist state corrupt? Certainly, yes. It's corrupt because it pretends to neutrality while introducing an ever-changing orthodoxy that it keeps up through the new trends and that new liturgy that I described. Its underlying assumptions are untrue. Not to mention it doesn't respect subsidiarity. So certainly, it's corrupt if we're talking about the modernist state. But what about these pre-modern conceptions of the state as an integrated social order? Can we condemn that? Number two, that we can effectively separate and replace an authority with the social life of the church and its institutions. Although great value can be derived, is my answer, from the participation, ultimately we cannot replace such an authority, the authority of the temporal sword, with the church. It may be the best we can do for the time being, but the calling of the clergy is distinct from the calling of the layman, who may exercise just authority in the business of the peace and the faith. There is no substitute for the temporal sword, and our priests are in no position to and should not be wielding it. Then number three, that the church and the state are inherently separate and often opposed institutions, one ruling so-called secular society, indifferent from the life of faith of its citizens, and the other providing for the spiritual well-being of the faithful. I would say no. The sword of justice should be wielded by the temporal authority in defense of the weak and the innocent, the widow and the orphan, and should take its cue from the natural law and from the reality of the incarnation and Christ's kingship. Although the two swords, the temporal and the spiritual, are distinct, they should be aimed at the same end, a just order under the kingship of Christ. So before I conclude, I'm going to reread that quote from Chesterton. From the time when the state was governed by the men who had most strength, most soldiers at his command, to the time when the state was governed by the man with the most money, the loudest voice, or the most newspapers at his command, the church has been both a help and a nuisance to the state. It has been a help in teaching people to behave themselves, keep social order, bear their trials patiently. It has been a nuisance in insisting that people who do so must be governed with justice on a socially and economically fair basis. The church has upheld the authority of the state, but it has most inconveniently set limits to and defined the proper exercise of that authority. Thank you.
Thank you, Skyler. I think that was awesome. A lot of us know that there's serious problems going on today, but it's hard to know how we got here. So thank you for a lot of that background. When I'm driving down the street and I see one of these trucks with these American flags, I'm like, yeah, I get fired up, I get kind of tingly. But when you look more into the Republican platform, it's really not as cool as we hoped that it would be. Does Chesterton have some practical solutions or suggestions for us families that don't, run the White House, or we're not mayors of towns or governors of states?
Yeah.
How do we impact this huge federal government that's $25 trillion in debt and
I think, yeah.
all this stuff? What do we do?
I don't think we should attempt to affect the federal government. I think Chesterton, being the good advocate of subsidiarity that he is, would certainly say we should do everything we can within the winnable locales that we find ourselves in. I don't think that going to the January 6th protest was a good move. If anyone here was at that protest, no offense, but I don't think that we're going to be able to affect anything if we think we can just engage in national politics. And you're right, the Republican Party platform and the whole "don't tread on me, I can do what I want with my property and my body, and nobody's going to tell me what to do," is not the proper mindset, as shown by, I think, the kind of more ideal, which is, again, this integrated social order, which takes its cue from what is good, not, this unconstrained liberty.
Other questions? Speak in the microphone so we can get it recorded.
The first part of my question is, there's such a nobility to the idea that we can sort of restore that type of fraternal concept of governance that you cited in the defense of Rome. But we live in this world where more than half of the people that we're around have such a diametrically opposed view of what is right and just for them. So how do we make sense of that? How do we, if the world really is starting to be completely divided down these battle lines, where is there hope in some sort of resolution?
I think we can look for signs of hope in how the Roman Empire was converted. The Roman Empire at the time of the barbarian invasions and at the time of its fall was a complete social, political, societal mess. Infanticide was common. Sexual perversions of all sorts were common. Families didn't look after one another. So the way we can do that is by being shrewd in terms of the conversion of the elites of our society, which is what we did then. St. Constantine, was a key component of the establishment of Christendom, and philosophers like Marius Victorinus and his public conversion as a prominent philosopher in Rome were huge. People forget that the pagans, or pagani, the holdouts were in the rural parts of Rome. So the elites were converted first. So number one, you focus on the conversion of as many people within our structures of influence that we can here in our neck of the woods. Number two, we live our lives in such a way where people see us and say, we want to be part of that. We want, to be part of that culture of life and renewal that is only possible within a Christian framework of the family and of community. So, right there. Oh.
Mike.
You brought up the ancient sacrifice of children.
Moloch, yes.
To Moloch.
Yep.
And then you just brought the contrast. Those were the elites.
Oh, yes.
Those aren't people in the backwater.
Correct.
Those are the elites.
Yep.
And then you just mentioned, we would hope for the conversion of the elites. And I thought about this in the last year or so. you know, there was a newspaper article not too many years ago. The actress Nicole Kidman was being interviewed, and she said that the director Stanley Kubrick told her, this is odd, but it was in a newspaper, that the elites of Europe were all pedophiles. And then we have Mr. Epstein.
Oh, yeah.
What appears to be, you know, at least the rape of children by powerful and wealthy people. And I'm wondering, we've all tried things, we've all hoped like this movement and that movement, and here's the Tea Party,
Yep.
and here's that, and let's read the distributist book, and let's do all
Yep.
these things. I'm wondering if maybe, and most people don't care, or they have all these different opinions. I'm wondering if what it will take is to shock the conscience, because nearly everybody I know, at least ordinary people, would find crimes against children horrible. And I think if they looked at the statistics of how many missing children there are, I don't know. I put that together. I try to tie those together. And I'm wondering if maybe that's what it takes, that sort of shock the conscience of people realizing what's going on.
You would have thought that would have ended abortion by now. I don't know if it will, you know. And to clarify, when I talk about elites, I'm not talking about, you know, the swamp creatures or those who are true, you know, the people going to Davos, you know. I'm talking about capable men in our area, you know, in these local communities that could play some role of genuine influence in these distributed
That would not
areas.
be cowardly in covering up something, for example.
Right, and who you know truly would be shocked by something like that. So, I don't have much hope for the global elite class as you're referring to them, but you know who knows?
But if it were exposed, maybe there's enough of the lower elites
Maybe
that
so.
would be like, this is too far. Finally, yeah, okay.
Maybe so.
Great question. Really disgusting and sad and satanic, but engaging. Bob.
Yes, so in order to have action and really gather powers together to achieve something, the end has to be really clear. So are you saying that the confessional state is the ultimate goal, even though we are working more on the local level originally?
I think the restoration of Christendom has to be a goal for any Christian. There's no getting around that.
Oh, I should say that. And therefore, don't we have to rethink what true evangelization is? Isn't there a tremendous confusion in the culture, and even in many who call themselves Catholic, as what true evangelization, true
Yeah.
ecumenism?
In fact,
Just
many
clarify
people,
that.
many people thought that people were not even Christian in the eras prior to the modern period, because they just went to church. They just were rote in their devotions, etc. They weren't really converted, and what they're ignoring is the fact that they were so converted that they just lived this as part of their daily life and as part of the exercise of authority, of the exercise of justice. This is all part of an integrated social order. So the evangelization that needs to take place is both at the level of individual hearts and minds, but also at the level of law, society, culture, etc.
Another question? Joe? Then we'll come over to you.
I don't have a question as much as an observation. You referenced the fact that the solution, or one of them, would be to, get out there, be a positive example of Christianity, and I'm looking at a number of friends and family punch the clock on the other side of, and here we are, right? That's not enough. It's not enough. I mean, we had our homes taken from us by communists and roving bands of heroin addicts, and I think we have something here that's
It's
to
a
be
winnable
valued.
battle here, though. That's the difference, right? So
No, exactly, and that's
Yeah.
I don't want people to think that it's just going to homeschooling picnics and going
No.
to church every Sunday.
Not at all.
We have to get more involved. We have to fill that space, and we have to be organized. And I don't know what that'll take, but it's coming. I know it's coming, and I know that I don't want to retreat. I mean, this is a wonderful spot, and the faith community is phenomenal. But anyway, just heads up.
I'm going to agree with you 100%. I led a men's book club, a parish men's book club, when the Rod Dreher book, The Benedict Option, came out. And there's a lot of good stuff in that book. I'm not going to knock the fact that that book came out, and it created a lot of good conversations. But at the same time, I think that approach that you described is woefully inadequate to effectively win back, you know, an area for ourselves that can be safe for our children and grandchildren. So completely agree. It needs to be both.
You're next.
How do we counteract and analyze the very powerful Catholics in political, the political arena claiming to be Catholic and promoting very anti-Catholic policies in our society politically, and then on that same side is clergy or bishops or cardinals in the Catholic faith that are sending mixed messages on Catholicism?
My best answer is we largely ignore them. I mean, that's really, I don't think there's all that much we can do about the Joe Bidens of the world, for example, or any number of people who are in these positions of power. It's very clear that they have been co-opted and are just cooperating with this state, this supposedly neutral state that I'm describing here. So I don't really see the point in expending much of our energy toward anything towards them. So I suppose that's my answer, but I don't know.
He's not going to get excommunicated anytime soon.
Someone mentioned people being shocked into awareness. There's been a lot of movement lately with the mama bears out there. Moms that have their children learning critical race theories in schools and coming in and just ripping the school board and saying, you work for me, you don't do this to my children.
Yep.
There is a movement for, it's called the Precinct Project, I believe, where I heard about it on Steve Bannon, but talking about people going to their precincts, running for things, getting involved,
Yep.
running on the school board, going to the school meetings, starting out small in your community subsidiarity.
Yep.
Because we have to start there, and that's what oh gosh, who's the guy they always talk about, the really wealthy man that works with politics, that puts people into different
George Soros?
Soros. That's one of the things that Soros did, was he would get judges in this community.
Oh, yeah.
He would get people into this community. So, he's a strategist.
Yes.
Lucifer is the master strategist.
That's right.
And so we have the Blessed Virgin Mary and the sacraments in the church, but we need to be mama bears and papa bears and step out of our comfort zone and do the things. But sometimes we have to get stung and shocked into action.
Yeah. Well, and I think, again, my point about the year 2020, hopefully they've played their cards too early such that we can actually respond in time.
Great comment. Joe.
So, excuse me. Something I've struggled with working, I'm a former federal employee myself for many years in the military, and living all over the country, is not saying something in context that I have with the public or even family that have fallen away from the church, not to rock the boat. And my foster father once told me you have to evaluate whether someone has a teachable heart, right? How would you suggest, because I've just been thinking about being judged potentially for me not saying something because I didn't want to be uncomfortable, or I didn't want to rock the boat and cause attention to myself. How do you discern at what volume you have conversations with strangers, should it arise, and to what level? I want to do the right thing, and I'm welcoming any advice on that.
Well, I'm not a moral theologian, so I'm not going to comment on your relative culpability of saying something or not saying something. But I will say that I think we do need to be wise about who we say what to, and that if the consequence is you being simply uncomfortable, I don't think that really, is a bar, that you can't get over. But if it's going to have potential consequences in terms of your employment or the ability to support your family or any number of these things, I think those are entirely legitimate to give you pause to make comment. So I think you just need to be wise about the reason why you're not making this. Is this due to a lack of courage and a discomfort with, awkwardness, or is it something more serious than that?
So in the context of the Orthodox clergy and Christian knights, that sort of stable medieval framework, the modern liberal secular movement has been able to stand on the foundation of a stable Christian society in order to gradually erode it over a very long period of time. In recovering an integrated society around Christianity, we can't rely on a strong foundation of nothing.
We can't.
To gradually erode it.
Right.
And so in recovering our vision of society, is it going to be, in your mind, does it have to come to a point in time where things flip in a period of extreme, uncertainty, maybe violence and so forth, or is there a way to gradually get it back?
I don't think there's any way to gradually get it back, the integrated social order that I've described, through the avenues of the current regime per se. I don't think there's any avenue to do that, really. Just as the old dying imperial order of Rome kind of had to die, in the West at least, in order for something new to arise, I think that's probably going to be necessary in our case. I think that we're a big enough civilization and we're geographically spread out enough that I'm not going to make any predictions as to how that manifests. It doesn't look good for some of the big cities, but I guess my short answer, or my answer to your question, is that let's look to Rome again, where you had basically a complete breakdown of social order, and you had Christian groups plus the new blood of the barbarians coming in to really shake things up such that you could actually have a new integrated social order. So,
Father Gaines.
Skyler,
is this the time you call me out for saying something wrong?
No, nothing to call you out on. No, it's great, and I am so enlightened by a lot of your history here, which is great. The Venerable Fulton Sheen, sometime in the late 60s or early 70s, said Christendom is dead. And he was, I think, prophetically, surely speaking to his own time, but then also to, what we've been experiencing for the past year or two. And I guess my question would be, in what ways do you see his prophetic call to be seeking to restore, not restore Christendom because he thinks it's dead, but to be restoring through the apostolic work, through, as Bob was mentioning earlier too, a revitalization and evangelization, or, because you can go to little pockets like, St. John's, which I love. You can go to St. Francis Xavier. You can go to small little parishes and places and see great bastions of Christianity and what seem like Christendom. But I think if we're honest with ourselves, even those places are struggling, right?
They're not instantiations of Christendom.
Right.
I would say in my framework, they're certainly not.
Mm-hmm. So because so many of us are still influenced by the world and affected by the world.
And again, they don't represent an integrated social order. One of the assumptions that I said was dangerous was thinking that the churches or parishes can replace the integrated social order of their own accord. I don't think that that's how this works. Christendom was not a great parish in the south of France, in the midst of heresy and this other stuff going on. No, the south of France was lost to Christendom at that time. It had to be retaken in its entirety.
I guess it's just a frustrating place to be as a priest too. But what what are we supposed to do? How do you evangelize in the midst of that? How do you seek to save souls in the midst of that? How do you bring together people? I guess we're doing it right here, right now.
Yeah,
too,
we're
but
trying.
thank you.
And the thing that I would say to that is that, you know, we as laymen who would, you know, seek to
Ready?
Okay, as I was saying, you know, we who would play the part of, you know, the temporal authority as much as we can, you know, those local elections, et cetera, we need your support as well as clergy, because again, it was tightly integrated into the same mission. You know, it was the business of the peace and the faith. It was one mission, proclaiming the truth of the gospel and the incarnation as manifested in politics and society comprehensively. It wasn't just a beautiful liturgy in one place that you attend once or 6 times a week or what have you, and that little slice of your participation in, you know, the life of the church. It was the entire social order. So it's a tall task, and it's not something that I think we can achieve by any means overnight, but there's a lot of instability right now in society. So I think that we have an opportunity now that we recognize the need for this, and we've stopped being complacent about thinking that we still can, you know, benefit from the sort of fumes of the dying embers of Christendom. That's gone. It's gone. So.
I might just add, Father, you know, we go to Mass and hear these homilies about, you know, don't beat on your neighbors and things, and that's great. But understanding the role of the family outside of the church, how we interact in civil society, how we run our businesses, how we buy products, you know, and helping educate some of us as to the moral components of those kinds of decisions as we interact in greater society. As human beings, we are moral agents, and every decision that we make, you know, has a moral value. Whether I buy a product that's made in China or in Bangladesh or in Spokane, you know, there's moral components to a lot of these kinds of things. Whether I work for a company like Amazon that hosts all the massive amounts of pornography, or I work for Yolks, the local grocery chain that's employee-owned. I mean, these are all, you know, important decisions. I saw a list of 100 things you can do to be a distributist today. Just really practical kinds of things. And we need that kind of guidance from some of our priests, too. Not that it's, you know, your job to do all of that, but that would be helpful. Father Flick? Come back.
So I've been scratching my head about the same problem for some years, as you know. So we as priests will give you the morals, we'll give you the spirituality and everything, but it comes down to a lot of the laity being kind of the foot soldiers. I've noticed more of this going on in the Protestant world than the Catholic world, unfortunately. I don't know if people are familiar with these things. I've been following for some years this thing called the Warrior Poet Society. It was this Army Ranger that he started training people on tactics, like, here, you know, someone comes to your house, here's how you defend your house. But he'll talk about marriage, he'll talk about being a man and so forth. And there's a lot of movements like this that Protestants and just guys trying to be men again are doing. And like she said about with the mama bears thing, unfortunately, a lot of the things that should be done by men are being done by women because the men are failing. They're very effeminate, which is sad. But I think a lot of it, the answers come through that kind of thing. That's just, we don't want to assume it's all going to be, I mean, yes, we pray, yes, we make sacrifices, but it's not necessarily going out on the street corner and preaching. I think we've degenerated so much. It's just teaching men to be men again and women to be women and fulfilling their roles in society. getting your kids involved, say, hey, don't be a loser, you know, go out and get a job and make something of your life, that kind of stuff. But it's not wrong to be a little bit forceful with it, I don't think. I never said those things about the neighbor. I think sometimes you got to push a little harder, but charity can be, you know, pretty rough sometimes, as I've learned. But I think that's a lot of it. Just on the natural level, there's a lot of action that can be taken. So that's my little.
Amen. Yes, we can learn a lot from our Protestant brethren.
Skyler, I just, an observation and a question. I agree with the idea that, you know, you need the integrated system, you know, the religious and the state. But it seems to me that, you know, when you look back at history, you know, the collapse of the Roman Empire and, you know, the rise of Charlemagne and whatnot, these elites, these leaders, these great leaders, they were inspired by the faith. They were inspired by the great church leaders, you know, Pope St. Gregory the Great and you know, St. Benedict and all these religious emissaries who are going out and inspiring them. And so it seems to me that really the answer to address the state issues really is the faith. That is the source, and that needs to be, you know, I think it starts there, and then that can further the state. So anyway, just an observation. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I agree with that. I think that the state or the temporal arm or sword has to be subordinate to the spiritual sword because one is higher than the other. That's just, you know, it's going to inform from the level of truth and revelation the proper policies, and it's going to inspire those leaders, as you said, you know. So you could add any number of episodes to that, you know, St. Ambrose standing up to the emperor, for instance. So I agree with that, you know. So yet again, we're just asking you to.
One problem I have with this concept of how state and church interact is that there's been a perversion of both church and state in our lifetime. So our church leadership has revealed itself to be at times completely compromised and sort of involved in wokeism and all of these sort of perversities that we're all trying to pray and struggle against in our own lives. And the state has been funding our church.
The church is an arm of the state in many respects.
And I think we should all acknowledge that, because it's where I think if there's a hope for some sort of better order in society, then we have to first sort of be aware of where those lines have been blurred and where it's been compromised, and acknowledge it and kind of be honest about it.
Yeah, and the Middle Ages or other earlier ages were not exempt from that either. You know, corrupt clergy were, you know, common. So it's not something that's just this easy thing. It has to be done through an inspired kind of interaction and cooperation of, you know, in the case of King St. Louis, it was, you know, Innocent III, a great pope, and his bishops, and some of the Dominican order, which was rising at that time as a reform movement within the clergy, you know, the Dominican orders, and then King St. Louis. So, I mean, that's always what you're going to have to contend with, I think. But we do have to be aware of that problem. I agree.
So we can't rely on the priest to fix everything.
I have a question about finding allies. Oh, it's not just the libertarians and the rhinos, but mainstream conservatives, almost every single one of them, have so imbibed this idea of the separation of church and state that they're no longer interested in an integrated social order. So if that's to be our goal, and I think it should be, where do we look for allies in this fight, and how do we recruit them?
It's actually, well, so I think that's, first I'll make 2 points. One, I think that's changing, because I think that we've seen the left has revealed that they are exercising their own moral imperialism as representatives of a particular religion. So I think that's changing. I think the Republican base is very different from the mainstream Republican politicians. So I think it's changing among the rank and file. And then lastly, I think that we can seek allies. I was talking to somebody the other day who is a union member who was a kind of left-leaning Christian because he thought that you had to be one in order to care about subsidiarity and issues like economic, distributism, et cetera. And so I think there's a lot of those people out there who will identify as liberal because they believe that the state should have that there should be a Christian component informing what the state does. And they think that's leftist or that's liberal or something. So I don't necessarily have a great answer for you. I think we're in a pretty dire position right now. I'm not going to sugarcoat that, but I also think that there are those people out there, and it could change significantly based on the events of the last year, 18 months.
Any other questions? I think we should keep in mind too that we hear from Christ that the road is narrow and few are going to make it, and it's easy to get on to Twitter or Facebook and see all these like horrible things going on in the world, and they're really bad. It is good to know what's going on, but we can get distracted by that. And our main focus is our community, our family, our kids. So let's get together, raise holy kids, marry them off to each other.
And be
corn.
intentional at looking at local politics and power and institutions, because we can potentially influence those in our area.
Absolutely. All right, we have another question back here from Deirdre.
So you mentioned converting the elite, and my question is, why not be the elite and encourage our young men and women, or even our
those aren't mutually exclusive.
Older men and women to join local and politics beyond that.
Totally agree.
And what will unify church and state is not our common goals and eye on each other, but our common goal and eye on God and what's above. And that will unify us. So I was hoping Galert would join the city council along with some other folks I have in mind. So so that kind of encouragement and support in politics, and we don't hear much about that. We just shirk and get scared and run away. So
yeah, not everyone's called to that particularly, but I don't think that converting or influencing local capable men and women who can fill those offices and also raising our own children and being part of that is mutually exclusive. I think we can do both.
I just wanted to mention with regards to allies, I guess I believe really and truly there's such a massive body of people out there, especially young people, who are innately not being brainwashed somehow. They're not being brainwashed by society, but then are also naturally drawn to goodness, truth, and beauty. 2 years ago, I was at a conference with Focus, which is Fellowship of Catholic University Students, with 17,000 young adults who are listening to talks from great, Scott Hahn and other great speakers. And it just fills me with a ton of hope that these young people whose parents are probably not in the same mindset, and who are parents who are probably trying to influence their children in negative ways and in bad ways, I would say. Anyways, it seems to me that there's great hope out there in young people, and then probably also maybe in just thinking of allies and just this other mass of people who look at the craziness of the left, and this can't be it's all nonsensical. They look 5 years ago, like you were mentioning, with the transgender, gender ideology stuff. 5 years ago, we couldn't even imagine a gender-bred person. Like, we couldn't even imagine the things that they have created in just a few years. And so I think there's a massive amount of people out there who are realizing this is crazy. And so we need our patron saint, G.K. Chesterton, to be the patron saint of common sense as well and raise up a generation. So.
Agreed, and we need to push beyond that to that fully integrated vision of Christendom. We can't stop at this, the government's gone too far this time, or it's violating our individual rights this time, we're not going to allow this. There needs to be an alternative vision that we comprehensively push for. So, yeah.
There's certainly some merit, Father, to your comments, but I take issue with a couple of things. One, I grew up on Capitol Hill in Seattle, and I've seen the transgender thing for a long time, not just the last 5 years. It's been coming for a while. And those 17,000 kids, they don't have jobs. We want them to have a meaningful engagement.
Jobs.
They certainly do some nice things, though. Any other last questions before we wrap up? Join me in giving Skyler a great round of applause. Yay! Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Skyler. Some action items. One is you can take a copy of this magazine and you can take it home and you can read it. And you can share it with your family and your friends. And you can also go to chesterton.org and you can sign up and pay $60 or something to become a member of the American Chesterton Society. And you will get like half a dozen copies of this magazine a year, which is really good. And you get discounts on all of Chesterton's books, which is good. The whole goal here is to spark an interest in you to read Chesterton. And that's where I think you really get to understand some of these principles at a foundational level and determine what those action items are for you in your particular environment and what you can do. Next month, we're trying to make this regular every month, every second Thursday. We have Dr. Jason Kintley. He's a local naturopath doctor, something of an expert on vaccines and specifically on COVID vaccines. So that should be very exciting. Lots of different aspects about vaccines or what maybe really aren't vaccines or being touted as vaccines, informed consent, and kids getting vaccinated without their parents knowing, and aborted fetal body parts in your body, worshiping Moloch, and ingesting their blood into your body and things, all kinds of things. It's going to be very exciting. And then in August, we have Mike Parrott coming from Kansas to talk about usury. The church has always been very against usury because you're not able to enslave yourself to another human being through debt. What does that mean? What is usury? And what does that mean to us today? So that'll also be very exciting. And then in September, we have Bishop Daly coming to join us. I'm not sure what he's talking about yet. But thank you so much for coming. Please continue to enjoy some drinks and eats and visiting. And God bless you. Thank you.